want you to picture a laminated menu, the kind with a coffee ring burned into the corner because somebody set a hot carafe down on it in 1994 and nobody ever replaced it. That menu belonged to the Blue Fork, my diner off Highway 41 outside Nashville. And I am telling you about it first because the man who tried to take everything from me once called it, to my face, a placemat with delusions. His name was Lucas Reyes. He was my business partner, and the last thing he ever said to me before I stopped answering his calls was, "Mara, be reasonable. Nobody remembers who drew the first line." Stay with me, because that sentence is the whole story, and by the end, you are going to understand why I smiled when he said it. He had no idea what I was. That is the part I want you to hold on to through all of this, because it is easy, listening to a story like mine, to think the woman telling it always knew she would win. I did not always know. What I knew was something Lucas had never once bothered to learn in 3 years of shaking my hand across a butcher block table. And I will get to exactly what that was, but not yet. First, you have to understand who was standing there when he decided I was a placemat. My name is Mara Langford. I was 29 years old the autumn all of this happened, and I have been underestimated by professionals my entire adult life. I grew up in Clarksville, 45 minutes north, in a house where my mother, Ruth Langford, kept a spiral notebook of every dollar that came in and every dollar that went out, and she made me copy the columns by hand so the numbers would live in my fingers and not just my eyes. She cleaned rooms at a motor lodge on Wilma Rudolph Boulevard for 19 years, and she used to tell me, wiping down a counter that was already clean, that the people who look right past you are handing you a gift, because a person who does not see you cannot guard against you. I did not understand that lesson at 8. I understood it at 29, in a paneled room full of lawyers, and I will tell you when. Here is the thing about me that Lucas filed away as a joke, and I filed away as a fact. Before I ever owned a diner, before I ever flipped an egg for money, I spent 4 years as a patent examiner for the United States Patent and Trademark Office. Art Unit 3600, the mechanical group, out of the satellite office in the old Federal Building. I read claims for a living. I sat under fluorescent lights that hummed at a pitch I can still hear if a room is quiet enough, and I decided whether an idea was new, whether it was obvious, whether some inventor's grand notion had already been drawn by a stranger in 1971 and buried in a drawer. I rejected filings for a living. I wrote the language that told people, in the cold grammar of the government, that the thing they thought they owned was not theirs. Remember that. It matters more than anything else I am going to say. I did not leave that job because I failed at it. I left because my father, Wade Langford, who fixed diesel engines and never once in his life filed a form on time, dropped dead of a heart attack at 56 while I was 300 miles away color-coding prior art. And I decided I was done spending my one life reading other people's dreams. I took the small inheritance, $38,000, and I bought a bankrupt breakfast place with a leaking walk-in cooler and a sign that still said Dell's, even though Dell had been gone a decade. I renamed it the Blue Fork. I put my mother's discipline into the books and my father's stubbornness into the hours, and within 2 years I was serving 200 covers on a Sunday and turning people away at the door. That is where Lucas Reyes walked in, on a Tuesday in March, wearing a jacket that cost more than my walk-in cooler had, and told me he loved what I was building. I want to be honest with you about Lucas, because if I paint him as a cartoon, you will not believe the rest, and worse, you will not learn anything. He was charming the way good light is charming. He was 34. He had done 2 years at a hospitality group in Atlanta and 1 failed juice concept in Austin, and he could make you feel, across a table, like you were the single most interesting person he had ever been lucky enough to sit near. He never raised his voice. In 3 years, I never once saw him rattled, Not when a supplier stiffed us, not when a health inspector wrote us up over a thermometer, not at the very end when the floor came out from under him. That composure was not a shield he put on. It was who he was, all the way down. And I underestimated it exactly the way he underestimated me, which is the symmetry I want you to sit with. We became partners because I was tired and he was persuasive. The Blue Fork was full, but it was not rich. A full diner and a rich diner are different animals, and anybody who has run one will tell you so. Lucas came in with $110,000 of somebody else's money and a plan to turn the Blue Fork into a small brand. Not a chain, he said. God, no, nothing so vulgar. A concept. Bottled sauces, a cookbook, a griddle line, a name that could live on a jar in a grocery store in Memphis and Knoxville, and eventually the whole Mid-South. He had the connections. I had the thing worth connecting to. We signed papers in April, 51-49 in my favor, because even tired, even flattered, I had my mother's columns living in my fingers, and I would not give up control of my own kitchen. Now let me walk you through how a man takes something from you slowly enough that you keep making excuses for him, because that erosion is the real crime, and the theft at the end is only its loudest hour. The first scene I want you to see is small. It is a Thursday, maybe 7 months into the partnership, and I have spent every night that week at my kitchen table drawing. I should tell you that I draw. I have always drawn. It is the only inheritance from my father that showed up in my hands instead of my temperament. Back in Clarksville, as a girl, I filled the margins of my mother's ledger notebooks with sketches of engines and bicycles, and once I got older, kitchen tools, because that is what surrounded me. When I was an examiner, I drew constantly, machine parts and mechanisms, half to understand the claims I was judging, and half because I could not stop. So when Lucas said brand, my hands already knew what to do. I designed a whole line. The logo, a stylized blue fork with the middle tine bent into a small flame, which I drew 40 ways before it was right, the jar shape, the label. And the thing I was proudest of? A griddle scraper with an angled offset handle and a beveled edge that let you get under an egg without tearing it. A real mechanical improvement over the flat steel blades everyone used. I had drawn 100 of those in my old life. I knew this one was new. That Thursday, Lucas came by to drop off invoices, and he stood behind my chair looking at the scraper sketch for a long time. And he said, "That's clever, Mara. That's genuinely clever." I remember being warmed by it. That is the part I am not proud of. I remember thinking, he sees it. He sees me. And I slid the whole folder across the table so he could photograph the pages for the manufacturer we were courting, a small metal shop outside Murfreesboro called Silverline Partners. I gave him my portfolio with my own hands. Hold on to that, too. The second scene is a dinner. This one is January of next year at a restaurant in Green Hills where the water comes in a bottle and the check is theater. Lucas had invited a woman named Maureen Vance, who ran regional buying for a specialty grocer group, and he had also, without telling me, invited a design consultant. And over the second course, he laid my sketches on the white tablecloth like a man dealing cards, except he narrated them in the first-person singular. I sketched this. I've been developing this offset design, my scraper. I sat there in a dress I had bought that afternoon, a navy dress that still had the fold lines from the box, and I watched Maureen Vance nod at my flame-tined fork and heard Lucas take the credit in a voice so smooth it did not even sound like lying. It sounded like weather. When I said, gently, because I was still making excuses, "Well, we developed it together," Lucas put his hand warmly over mine on the tablecloth and said to the table, "Mara's too modest. She's the heart of the kitchen," which is a sentence designed to sound like a compliment and function like a lid. You would have felt what I felt. A hot flush up the neck, the particular humiliation of being praised into silence. I did not make a scene, not because I am serene. I am absolutely not serene. Ask anyone who has worked a Saturday rush with me. I have a temper my mother spent 20 years teaching me to spend wisely instead of freely. I did not make a scene because a scene was what he could survive, and I was already, without quite admitting it, beginning to count columns. The third scene is the one where I understood it was deliberate. In March, almost exactly 2 years after Lucas first walked in, I was doing what I do every quarter, which is read everything, because a woman who examined patents for 4 years does not sign what she has not read. Buried in a folder of Silverline paperwork was a copy of a provisional patent application. United States Patent and Trademark Office letterhead. I knew the letterhead the way you know your own childhood phone number. The application was for a griddle implement with an offset angled handle and a beveled leading edge. My scraper. And the sole named inventor, the only name in the box where the truth is supposed to go, was Lucas Reyes. I want to tell you what I felt, and I want to be precise, because precision is the only thing that ever saved me. I did not feel shock. Shock is for people who were not paying attention, and I had been paying attention since the Navy dress. What I felt was a cold, clean clarity, like the first breath of walk-in air on a July day, and under it, one specific thought arrived and sat down and would not leave. He filed a patent. He filed a patent on my design. And here is the small, terrible, private thing that only you and I know so far. Filing a patent meant a stranger, some examiner in some humming office, was going to sit in the exact chair I used to sit in and read the exact kind of document I used to write and decide whether my own idea belonged to the man who stole it. That is the moment my mother's lesson finally landed, 21 years late. The people who look right past you are handing you a gift. Lucas had never once in all our hours asked me what I did before the diner. He knew I could cook, and he knew I could draw, and he had decided that was the whole of me. He did not know I had spent 4 years as the exact kind of person who kills applications like his for a living. He had walked into the one theft in America where I was, functionally, the house. Now here is where I have to be careful telling you this, because the easy version is that I picked up the phone and torpedoed him that afternoon. And that is not what happened. And the difference is the whole reason I am able to tell you this with my head up. I could not examine his application myself. I had left the office. And even if I had not, you cannot rule on your own theft. That is not how anything clean works. But I still had friends inside those walls, and I still knew the machinery. And above all, I knew the law, which does not care how charming you are. So I did the slow thing, the disciplined thing. I sat with it for 11 days before I did anything at all, and I let Lucas keep being Lucas, keep photographing my pages, keep telling Maureen Vance that his line was coming, because a man who thinks he is winning is a man who does not cover his tracks. The person I called was Ellen Boudreau. Ellen and I had started at the patent office the same summer. 2 women in a unit of men who kept calling us the girls. And she had stayed when I left and moved up and gone to law school at night and come out the other side as an intellectual property attorney with her own small practice in a converted house near Belmont. Ellen answered on the second ring and let me talk for 11 minutes without interrupting, which is its own kind of loyalty. And when I finished, she said only, "Send me everything. And Mara, you kept your original drawings, didn't you?" I told her I had every sketch dated because I number and date every page, a habit from the office I never broke. There was a silence on the line, and then Ellen laughed, low, and said, "Oh, he has no idea, does he?" He did not. Here is what preparation actually looked like, because I want to demystify it for you. There was nothing magic in it, only patience and paper. Over the next 6 weeks, I gathered proof the way my mother reconciled a checkbook, one line at a time. I had the sketchbooks, 41 dated pages, the earliest of them 14 months before Lucas's filing date, which in patent law is not a small thing. It is the whole ballgame. I had the metadata on the photographs Lucas himself had taken of my drawings, which lived, thanks to a shared cloud folder he had set up in a fit of efficiency, under my account, time-stamped, his own greed keeping my receipts. I had emails where I described the offset handle to him in my own words. And I had one more thing, the thing that turned a partnership dispute into a story worth staying for. And I am going to tell you about it now, because you have earned it. When I designed the whole Blue Fork line back at my kitchen table, I did not just draw a scraper. I built a brand, and I registered it, quietly, the way I do everything, under a name that was not Mara Langford. Years before, when I first started selling small runs of my sauces at the Clarksville Farmers Market to test them, I had not wanted my diner's name on a jar that might flop. So I invented a maker. I called her Della Marsh. It was half a joke and half a shield. Della, for the old Dells sign I had painted over, and Marsh, my grandmother's maiden name. I filed the trademark for Della Marsh myself, because I knew how, and I built the whole sauce and cookbook and griddle tool identity under that pen name, and I kept the registration current, and I told exactly 2 people in the world it was me. One was Ellen. Lucas was not the other. By the time Lucas laid my sketches on that white tablecloth in Green Hills, Della Marsh was quietly worth something. A regional distributor had picked up the first 3 sauces on a handshake and a small purchase order, and then a second larger buyer had come in, and by that spring the Della Marsh mark was under a licensing offer that valued the brand, the name, the marks, the trade dress, the whole quiet identity I had built with my own hand, at just north of $4 million. Lucas was out in the world trying to steal a scraper. He never knew he was standing next to a brand worth $4 million because the woman who owned it had, on purpose, made herself look like a placemat with delusions. I did not go to war with all of this at once. That is the mistake the story usually tells you to make. The big confrontation, the raised voice, and it is exactly wrong. Because a man like Lucas feeds on a confrontation. It gives him a stage, and it gives him the mask 100 fresh reasons to stay on. So I chose my ground, and my ground chose itself in the strangest way, through a death. Lucas's great uncle, an old man named Harlan Reyes, who had made a comfortable fortune in commercial refrigeration and lived out past the county line on 40 acres, passed away that April at 83. Harlan was the reason Lucas had money to burn. That $110,000 he brought into the Blue Fork had been a gift from the uncle, and Lucas had spent 3 years describing himself to that old man as an entrepreneur, a builder, a man of ideas. There was to be a reading of the will out at Harlan's house on a Thursday evening, and Lucas, who could not resist an audience, had asked me to come. He framed it as support. He wanted the family to see him beside a going concern, beside the woman he introduced now, more and more, as his partner, in a way that blurred the business line on purpose. I said yes. I said yes because Ellen and I had, by then, everything we needed, and because I understood that the will reading was the one room where all the people whose opinion Lucas had spent his whole life managing would be sitting in the same set of chairs. Let me set the room for you, because you should be able to see it. Harlan's house was long and low, brick from the 1960s, with a den that ran the whole back length and looked out over a pasture where 2 old horses stood, not doing much. There were maybe 18 people in folding chairs and good sofas, Rhea's cousins and a sister and an old business partner of Harlan's, and at the front, a lawyer named Curtis Deal with a leather folder and reading glasses on a beaded chain. There were deviled eggs going soft on a sideboard and a percolator of coffee that somebody kept refilling, and the whole room smelled like coffee and lily arrangements, which is a smell I now associate forever with the exact taste of a thing coming right. Lucas sat in the second row in a charcoal jacket, relaxed, one ankle on his knee, entirely at home. I sat beside him with a canvas bag at my feet that he assumed held nothing, and Ellen Boudreau sat 2 rows back in a gray suit that Lucas had been told belonged to a family friend. The will itself was ordinary, and it took 20 minutes. Harlan left the land to his sister, a sum to the church, the refrigeration business proceeds split among the cousins. To Lucas, he left $40,000 and a sentence Curtis Deal read out in his flat lawyer's voice, which was Harlan hoping his great-nephew would, and I am quoting the will now, learn the difference between a good idea and a good man. You could feel the room shift on that line, a small collective breath, and I watched Lucas take it without a flicker, nodding gently as if it were a compliment, the mask seamless. That composure is when I knew for certain he would never break the way the stories say. So I did not aim to break him. I aimed to end him cleanly, in front of the exact 18 people whose regard was the only currency he truly cared about, and then to walk out and never think about him again. When Curtis Deal closed his folder and asked if there was any other business, Lucas stood, because of course he did, and said he wanted to take one moment, with family gathered, to share something Harlan would have been proud of. And he began, to that room of grieving cousins, to pitch. He talked about the brand he was building. He said the word innovation. He reached into his own bag and brought out a laminated board, and on it, blown up large, was my flame-tin fork and my scraper and my label. And he said, and I will never forget the exact words because they were the last free breath he took, "This is a design I developed, and it's about to become something this family can be proud of." I let him finish. That was Ellen's counsel and my mother's temper working together for once. I let him get all the way to the end of his own sentence, let him accept the soft, admiring murmur of the cousins, and then I stood up in my navy dress, and I said in a voice that did not shake because I had spent 3 years teaching it not to, "Lucas, I need to correct the record for your family because they deserve the truth on a night like this." He turned to me, still smiling, still certain, and said, warmly, for the room, "Mara, this isn't the time." And I said, "It is exactly the time. That design on your board is mine. I drew it 14 months before you filed a patent on it, and I have the dated pages in this bag. But that isn't the part I want your family to hear." I let that sit for 1 second, and then I did the thing I had waited 2 years to do. I told them what I was. I said, plainly, so a room of grieving people could grasp it in one breath, before I owned the diner, I spent 4 years as a patent examiner for the United States government. I read applications exactly like the one Lucas filed, and I rejected them for a living. His filing was going to a colleague of mine to be examined, and I want to tell you what she found. I nodded at Ellen, who stood, and introduced herself as an attorney, and said 6 calm sentences. That the provisional application naming Lucas Reyes as sole inventor had been reviewed. That there was clear, dated, prior art predating his filing by more than a year, created by another person. That the application was, in the language of the office, dead on arrival, and that any claim of ownership over the design was legally hollow. She did not raise her voice once. She sounded like weather, too, and I watched Lucas learn, in real time, what it feels like to be on the receiving end of a smooth voice describing your ruin. Here is where the story wants a villain to crumble, and he did not. And I need you to hear how he did not, because it is the truest thing in this whole account. Lucas did not go pale. He did not stammer. He set his laminated board down on a chair, gently, the way you set down something you have decided you no longer need. And he looked at me with something almost like respect, and he said, "Well, you've been busy." Just that. The mask stayed exactly where it was. For a second, I understood how a person could love him and never once catch him. But it did not matter that he did not break, and that is the lesson under the lesson. I did not need him to break. I only needed the room to see. And the room had seen. His cousins were looking at him now the way you look at a stranger who has been sitting in your family's chair. And Harlan's sister had set down her coffee, and Curtis Deal had taken off his reading glasses. Lucas's currency, the only one he had ever spent, their belief, had just gone worthless in 20 seconds, and he was too intelligent not to know it. And then I gave him the last thing, not because I needed to, but because my mother taught me that when you finish a column, you finish it all the way down. I reached into the canvas bag and I set on the sideboard, next to the softening deviled eggs, a jar of sauce with a label on it, my Flameteen fork, the name Della Marsh across the top in the type I had chosen at my kitchen table. And I said, one more correction. This brand, the one Lucas has been telling buyers is coming, it already exists. I built it. I own it, every mark, under a name I registered myself years ago. There's a licensing offer on it right now that values it at just over $4 million. Lucas spent 2 years trying to steal a scraper from a woman who was quietly holding a brand worth millions, and he never once thought to ask. I looked at him, and for the first and only time something moved behind his eyes. Not fear, Lucas did not do fear, but arithmetic, the sound of a man recalculating everything he thought he had been standing on. Then it was gone, and the mask was back, and he said, softly, "Nobody remembers who drew the first line, Mara." And I said, "Your family will." I did not stay to watch what came after. I want you to understand that, because the story you have heard 300 times ends with the heroine standing over the ruined man, drinking in his destruction. And I did not want his destruction. I had learned by then that wanting it would have kept me tied to him. I picked up my bag, I thanked Curtis Deal, I told Harlan's sister I was sorry for her loss and meant it, and Ellen and I walked out across the gravel to my truck while the light went orange over the pasture and the 2 old horses finally moved. I will not pretend the aftermath was nothing, because that would be a lie, and I have told you no lies. We dissolved the partnership over the following 10 weeks. Because I held 51% and because Lucas's entire claim to the brand had evaporated in one paneled room, the negotiation was short. He walked away with his $40,000 from Harlan and his $110,000 from the original stake returned to him in full, which I insisted on because I did not want $1 of his money living in my kitchen. I wanted a clean break, the whole thread cut, nothing of him left in the blue fork. He did not fight it. Men like Lucas do not fight losing battles. They simply appear, whole and charming, in some other city. And I am told he did, that he surfaced a year later with a restaurant group in Charlotte, telling a new table that he was the heart of something. Let him. His going was not my victory. My staying was. Because here is what I kept, and my mother's voice is in every word of this. So listen. I kept the blue fork, all of it. The coffee-ringed menus in the walk-in that still groans, and the flame-tined fork on the door, which I had painted there myself the week the partnership ended. I kept Della Marsh, and I signed that licensing deal in Ellen's converted house office on a Friday afternoon, and the 2 of us drank cheap Prosecco out of the diner's water glasses because I refused to celebrate my mother's daughter's win with anything pretending to be fancier than it was. $4 million and change for a name I invented to protect a jar of sauce I wasn't sure anyone would buy. I kept my drawings, all 41 dated pages, and I framed one of them, the 14th version of the Flametine fork, and hung it in the diner over the register where every single person who pays their check has to look at a woman's original idea. And I kept Ellen, who is now not just my attorney, but the person I call first. And I kept my mother, who lived long enough to sit in a corner booth on the day the deal closed and watch me count a real column at last, and who said to me, wiping down a table that was already clean because some habits are love, "See, they handed it to you." I kept, most of all, the thing Lucas never understood he was standing next to, which was not the money and not the brand, but a woman raised by people who taught her that dignity is not something they can take, only something you can hand over. And I never once handed it over. Not at the Green Hills dinner, not at the will reading, not on any of the nights I sat alone with the proof and chose patience instead of rage. So when people ask me how it felt, in the end, I tell them the truth, which surprises them. It did not feel like triumph, not the kind that needs another person to be on the floor. It felt like walking out of a humming room I had been sitting in far too long, out into orange light, free, with everything that was ever actually mine still in my hands, and nothing of his weighing them down. The last thing I painted on the door of the blue fork, under the fork with the flame, was Della Marsh's name, small, in the corner, where the coffee ring used to be. Come by some Sunday. I'll pour you a cup, and I'll tell you the horses finally moved.